Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be with you, if not seeing you in person. At least great to have you here for this session around the Online Harms Bill. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Debbie Abrahams. I'm the chair of the All-Party Group for Compassionate Politics, as well as being the MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth. Must get that in as well. And we're discussing today, as I say, the Online Harms Bill, and I'm absolutely delighted to have such a fantastic group of panellists who I'm going to introduce you to in a moment. But I just wanted to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about Compassionate Politics and the All-Party Group, which we set up coming up to a year ago now, because we were really concerned about the nature and content and tone of political discourse was tending to be a little bit bullying in its context. And this group is about like-minded parliamentarians who want to change the culture within our political system. So the focus being on kindness, and that's not something that's warm and fluffy, but it's about mutual respect and ensuring that we can be more compassionate towards everyone. I'm just looking at my notes here. So our purpose is very much around that, shifting that. We're looking for the opportunities to collaborate, such as today, but also in terms of when we don't agree necessarily with everyone, doing it in a respectful way. So the group has been looking at online abuse for a few months now. We were very concerned about this, and again, particularly looking at how this is affecting politics and how people are being switched off by it. Basically, it goes way beyond Westminster. And we launched a campaign to stop the hate in conjunction with our partners, More United, the Women's Institute, Hope Not Hate, and Centenary Action. And that was, as I say, in December. So this today is an opportunity to build on that, looking forward to, as I say, the Online Harms Bill, now that we have had the government's response from the Online Harms White Paper. And I'm delighted to introduce the panel that we have today. The first speaker that we're going to have up will be Seyi Akiwowo, and I hope I pronounced that right, Seyi. Then we have Joe Mulhall and Siobhan Baillie MP, one of my colleagues on the Work and Pension Select Committee, Rosie Duffield MP, my Labour Party colleague from Canterbury, who's also the chair of the Women's PLP. And then we go over to you. So if you have a question, please do put it in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll try and make sure that we see that. And then finally, we have Jeremy Wright, the Right Honourable Jeremy Wright MP, Chair of the All-Party Group for Digital Regulation and Responsibility, who will be summarising in his remarks our conversation and where we need to go next. So each of our speakers has been given a sort of framework to discuss in their 7 minutes, and I'm going to hand over to Seyi.
Thank you very much. Just to say, my name is Seyi Akiwowo, and I'm the founder and executive director of Glitch, and we're all about making the online space safe for all, and that is through delivering workshops, resources and training to those who are online at the moment so they can be safe and be able to navigate the online space safe, as well as looking at long-term systematic change, so what the role of government and tech companies can play. So I'm super pleased that we're having a conversation about the long-awaited Online Harms Bill. I think the first thing to talk about is, what do we mean by online abuse? So for us at Glitch, online abuse is a catch-all term that talks about different experiences, tactics, from stalking, harassment, dead naming, hate speech, doxing, to the sharing of non-consensual photography, and then new forms of online abuse that we are seeing thanks to the growth of technology and new platforms like deep fakes and the image-based abuse. And I think when we're talking about online abuse and harms, and if there's one key takeaway I can pass on from this point, is that we have to see online harms from an intersectional lens. We have to understand that many different people experience online abuse in a different way. And if we only look at the abuse that certain groups, certain privileged groups, certain majority groups experience online abuse, then this bill will fall short of protecting people online and will only continue to perpetuate the same kinds of abuse that we are seeing not being tackled. I think the second thing I'd like to highlight in my 7 minutes is the importance of COVID-19 and how online abuse has increased during lockdown. Ofcom has told us in many quarterly reports that online usage has massively increased, which in some ways is great because it means that we are connecting, we are tackling isolation, we are able to use the internet in the amazing ways that we have been doing. But there is a real concern that means that online abuse will increase, and we did sadly see that last year. Our Ripple Effect report, which we did in collaboration with End Violence Against Women Coalition, and thanks to colleagues at Home Hope Not Hate for your amazing support and statement on that report, showed that online abuse had increased for women and non-binary people, and that when you look at it through a racial lens, this increased to 50%. Also on the backdrop of this is obviously women being furloughed, women in precarious unemployment and so forth. And so there's a real concern around the role that employers now play when it comes to online abuse and how they can support freelancers, zero-hour contract staff, journalists, women in public life, so that they are able to carry out their role safely and confidently. But sadly, if we're going to continue having lockdown measures, which we obviously need, we need to understand what it can be put in place right now to protect people. And the one thing that we're calling for outside the online harms bill, but can obviously be included, is a percentage of the digital services tax, which has generated something like £400 million, to be ring-fenced towards ending online abuse. So that should look at things around enforcement, that should look at things around education, and that should look at things around a public health approach to our online space. Because actually, if there's anything that I've learned from last year, and there's many things, it's from Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd. And that made us all take a moment to reflect on what does punitive action actually lead to? Our justice reform, how does that actually lead to any kind of systemic change? And I think if there's one thing for us to reflect on is how, as much as I find trolls very much annoying online, how much will sending them to prison for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, or a suspended sentence actually make our online spaces safer? And actually, how can we start looking at a public health approach to quite a lot of these harms? Because when you unpick quite a lot of the people that are doing trolling, when I've spoken to Instagram yummy mummies who are being trolled by their colleagues who are using anonymous accounts, a lot of this is being driven by isolation, by depression and mental health. So I really would like to see money being ring-fenced that is being generated from these platforms to look at tackling some of these issues from a public health approach. But then finally, what do we want to see from the online harm bill? I think there are 3 things. Firstly, education. We need to see more than just media literacy. It's not enough ensuring that young people know how to work the Sky remote and how to do PowerPoint slides. We need to make sure that young people know how to be critical thinkers and engage in content online in a safe way. We need to ensure that all people know how to report abuse to the platform and also escalate it to law enforcement. We also need to understand what our responsibility is, and that is going to take a real culture change, a real forming of social norms, which I think Compassion in Politics is a really good framework to help us understand what that social norm can be. So what does it look like when you quote tweet people? How does it look like when you've maybe indirectly posted a photo or a selfie with somebody without permission? How do we start having conversations around things that are not illegal but are definitely harmful, and building a good culture online, and understanding that as digital citizens, we both have rights and responsibilities. I think the second thing we want to make sure, and I understand that the terminology may not sit with everybody, but we need to think about making sure that the form of online harms that we talk about doesn't just look at children and doesn't just look at cybercrime, or just does not look at women from a very sexualized point of view. We need to understand that women experience all forms of online abuse, particularly women of color and those with multiple intersecting identities. It was a real shame that in the proposed bill of the online harms, and I'm glad that there's been growth since then, but there's still a way to go, that the only examples mentioned about women's abuse was around Jess Phillips being there being a joke around Jess Phillips being raped. There is so much more to women's experience of online abuse than just sexual assault and harassment, and we have to make sure that it's inclusive of that. And then the very last thing I would say is a duty of care that we put on tech companies from the very inception of design of the platform, of new products. We saw it recently with the rollout of audio on Twitter, and there was no thinking about how this would alienate our disabled communities and friends, and how this would then cause more abuse for women. And we already saw within 20 minutes of the platform being rolled out to certain iPhone, Apple users, that women were experiencing online abuse and harassment. So we really need to be thinking about, from the very inception of products being designed, that it's there with a safety by design principle, which also means that then we need to call on tech companies to be a lot more diverse than they currently are. But I'm really looking forward to answering your questions and hoping that you can champion your recommendations around the online harms bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seyi, and my apologies for not pronouncing your beautiful name better, but thank you. That was really, really thought-provoking. So again, please do start putting your questions in the chat. But before we get to the Q&A, I'm going to hand over now to Joe.
Hello. Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. I can't agree more with everything that has just been said. It's brilliantly put, and I agree with it all. And the work of Glitch in this has been something that we at Hope Not Hate have looked at really, really closely over the last year or so on this, and it's amazing. So I'm from Hope Not Hate. My name's Joe Mulhall. We look specifically, or more specifically, at the far right and the online far right, which obviously plays a role in this, but in some ways we look at the more organised players that are engaging in online harms, as well as some of the more broader issues that are being discussed. So I just wanted to touch on a few things and kind of highlight how the far right and the organised kind of hate distributors use social media and how that affects the online harms bill. I think there's a few things. The obvious ones are very clear. The far right use social media to attack their victims, to harass people. They use it to organise, they use it to propagandise, they use it to recruit, they use it to radicalise, they use it to fundraise, all of these things you'd expect. And one of the really important things, of course, is understanding the dynamics between online and offline. You know, a lot of the online harms, yes, we have to talk about online harms, but this stuff also plays out in our communities and on our streets. And many of the people that experience online harms will also experience these things in their workplaces, in their communities, and from direct people like the far right. And from the off, one of the things I just think is really important in this whole debate is how we frame the debate around online harms. I'm going to talk very briefly about how I think things like deplatforming are positive, and how it's important that online harms regulates this sort of stuff. But we have to frame this as an expansion of free speech. Many of the communities that were just mentioned, and the real centrality of taking an intersectional approach here, these voices are already marginalized on our social media and online more broadly, and they're shut down by people on the far right, by people that are oppressing these communities and attacking these communities. And dealing with online harm shouldn't be framed as just shutting away and getting rid of the people we don't want online. It needs to also be an understanding about how we expand the plurality of voices online so that we actually have more genuine free speech. And we have to be really careful, because if we get this wrong, this will be, the online harms discussion will be framed as shutting down freedom of speech. And it's not actually, it's about expanding it. So just a few very brief points. Yes, the far right uses social media in all the ways I just mentioned that you would expect, but I think it's important to understand that it's actually altered the nature of the way that online, or the far right does its business, it does its activism. At Hope Not Hate, we talk regularly about this thing called a post-organisational far right. And while the hatred of the far right and the politics of the far right has been relatively consistent for a very long time, the internet and social media has changed the way they do business. The days, while of course we still have big far right organizations, we have kind of, you know, they're not what they were. The BNP is not what it's were. The National Front is not what it was. What we now have on top of those traditional organizations is this post-organizational world, which is thousands and thousands of far right individuals all over the world, offering micro donations of time, sometimes money, and they collaborate together online towards common political goals. often completely outside of formalized organizations. And what we see here is they draw on a increasing selection of what you might call far-right social media influencers. For most of the post-war period, becoming far-right or getting involved meant signing up, going to a meeting, delivering newspapers, selling newspapers, etc. There was kind of traditional ways you did it. Now you can sit in your bedroom and you can send harassment to someone anywhere in the world. This is a globalized phenomenon. You can have people experiencing hate online in the UK that is being organized by far-right networks in North America or Australia or Asia or anywhere in the world. We have to think beyond just our street and our community now. We have to go well beyond that. The far right online is now a many-headed hydra, if you will. And this makes it very, very difficult when it comes to how do we deal with this phenomenon. No longer can you just take away the leader of a movement and the movement collapses. Now we just have a replacement emerges. We have thousands of people. And also the way they use social media is like a series of synapses. They pass information between them. You know, if you think about anti-Muslim prejudice online, yes, people will be talking about halal chicken nuggets in a school in Stoke, but they will also be talking about halal chicken nuggets at a school in Warsaw or Berlin. And they crowdsource their anger and they crowdsource their information. And we have these super sharers that essentially are these nodes where this information passes through, these big far-right figures. Understanding the global nature of this problem is going to be central to understanding how we get an online harms bill that is effective. There's not necessarily easy answers for these, but we need to consider them. So what are our options in terms of the online harms bill? Well, in one way, I think it's about disrupting these synapses, breaking these networks, and deplatforming is important to this. Part of this is a real simple one. Beyond the bill, it's just the social media companies need to enforce their existing policies. Many of them have great policies on paper. They just don't deal with it in the real world. But I do think, as many people, and I think there's probably a consensus forming, that the time of self-regulation of these tech companies is over and time for legislation is now and important. And the question is why? Part of it is we've seen just in the last year, if I take two very brief examples, how this online behavior from the far right, this kind of hateful online behavior has had real impact. One is the expansion and explosion of the conspiracy scene. As has just been mentioned about COVID, we've seen social media used by conspiracy mongers that have started in the niche corners of the far right internet in America and spread around the world. Things like QAnon, things like COVID conspiracies, anti-vax conspiracies have exploded on mainstream social media platforms, and once again shown us that social media companies are only acting in response to crises. They're only acting in response when there is major international or public pressure around something like the storming of the Capitol, when they then start another wave of deplatforming. We need to have a robust system of legislation that means that, as has been mentioned, that we build safeguards into our social media and into our digital systems to mean that we can deal with the problems before they arise, rather than relying on the tech companies to act in response to crises when there is international pressure. Another good example of this is the kind of migrant crisis discussions of the last year within the British far right about cross-channel migration. Here we saw how they use social media so effectively and how it affects public discourse. There was the creation of these kind of so-called far-right citizen journalists that stood at Dover every day, live streaming footage on YouTube, creating this anger and animation within the British far right, and it spread onto Facebook and Twitter, and then it spread through Telegram, and it built up. And then you see the next group up of the British far right, Britain First, For Britain, these more traditional organizations holding demonstrations. You see Nigel Farage then talking about it in right-wing media, and then we start to see some of the rhetoric from Priti Patel, which is pretty indistinguishable from some of the stuff we're seeing here. Here we're seeing how the far-right ecosystem works. It creates energy, it crowdsources information, and it can in the long run affect mainstream narratives. So I think there's a few things at play. The final thing I want to mention in terms of the online harms bill is we have to understand, when we're creating legislation, how the online space works. Too much of the discussion is just solely talking about Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, the big major platforms. And of course, that is in many ways, understandably, where most people will experience abuse and harassment. And that's really, really important that we deal with those platforms. That's where most people are. However, there is a kind of slightly binary understanding that there is these mainstream platforms, and people leave those mainstream platforms when they're kicked off them and they go to, other platforms like Telegram or Gab. Actually, what we see at Hope Not Hate on a daily basis is there is a plurality of social media platforms, ranging from mainstream platforms like Facebook and Twitter, co-opted platforms which are not ostensibly far right but used by people on the far right, like Telegram, etc. And then these bespoke platforms, which are often very small, but things like BitChute, the video sharing one, or Gab, which are created consciously to host news content by the far right, often created by the far right themselves. And many of the people that we would monitor at Hope Not Hate use all of these platforms simultaneously. And they use them for different purposes. They might use Facebook and Twitter to harass and target people, or to propagandize and fundraise. They might organize their planning on Telegram. They might get engaged in their really extreme behavior in closed groups on Signal. And understanding that it's not just this binary from big platform to small platform is going to be central to making the online harms bill effective. They use them simultaneously, and they use them for different purposes. And that's why one of the things that I think is kind of covered, but we need to make sure is really kind of buttressed in this, is the smaller platforms. You know, too often, and it's been mentioned about building in from the very beginning safeguards in these platforms. We have to understand that not all tech platforms have a problem they don't want. Some of the tech platforms we monitor are consciously created with a view to propagating and pushing hatred. And so how we talk about tech platforms often is from a perspective of how do we deal with the fact that some platforms have a hatred problem that they don't want. We also need to add into the conversation platforms that are designed for exactly that purpose, and have a conversation about how we deal with that with online regulation. And then finally is legal but harmful, as has been mentioned. Much of the behavior that we see from the far right doesn't cross the threshold of legality, becoming illegal. You know, and often it might be, for example, especially harassment campaigns, is 1,000 people sending one message, none of which those messages might break the law, but collectively is clearly harassment. So, and that can have huge detrimental effects on the people experiencing that sort of online behavior. So making sure that as we go forward, and let's hope this bill comes soon, we've all been waiting for it for far too long, as it kind of comes into play, we need to make sure that it continues to be broad. Its broadness is one of its positive elements to this, and we make sure that we are robust enough and strong enough to fight for it continuing to stray broad, carrying on beyond just the legal and concluding the legal but harmful, and making sure then that we have a bill that actually deals with some of these problems and we don't let it get chipped away. And central to that is going to be this thing about making sure we frame this in a way that is about expanding free speech, expanding and allowing voices, a plurality of voices, especially from affected minorities and communities and these people that experience intersecting identities, their voices. We create an online space which is more positive, where more voices are heard, not just by shutting down the hateful ones. Cheers.
Great stuff, Joe. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to move on now to introduce Siobhan and Baillie. We've been seeing a lot of each other, Siobhan, haven't we?
I know, we're on team. You're sick of the sight of me. I'm going to time myself because I could talk about this all day. But you know, I do want to start by saying that so I'm MP for Stroud in Gloucestershire. Been MP for the last 12 months. Happened to have a baby and deal with a global pandemic in my first 12 months of doing this job. So it's definitely been a roller coaster. But I do want to say that I've got real high hopes for change in this area, not least because this is cross-party work whenever it is mentioned, as you've seen from the panel today. Fantastic organisations that you're hearing from, but there's a brilliant organisation called Clean Up the Internet, led by a gentleman in my constituency, Stephen Kinsella, and the government does really care. I personally think the online harms bill should do more. I think it can do more, but we have got real desire for change and to help in this area. And I think the tech companies know the writing's on the wall and the public's behind us as well. So I do want to start on that kind of positive note. I mean, the reason I came into this and became particularly interested in it is because I dare to have a baby, as I mentioned, being an MP, and the abuse that I got from over email as well, not just online, was nothing short of ridiculous. And I'm pretty thick-skinned, but you know, the suggestion that I either shouldn't have opened my legs, shouldn't have had a baby, can't do the job because I have a baby, and you know, all the colourful language that you can imagine that comes with that, on top of the normal day-to-day stuff that, you know, Tory scum, you're evil, politicians don't care, they spend all this money, they do X, Y, and Z. You know, the negativity and the drama and the hate that is often spat out at politicians and a range of people in the online presence is absolutely unacceptable. And in terms of the misogyny, we know that when there are attacks on women, often underlying those attacks are some suggestion, deep-rooted suggestions that women can't do a particular job, or shouldn't be saying a particular thing, or shouldn't actually be even putting their heads above the parapet. And it's incumbent on all of us, and there's some wonderful men, women, everybody is working really hard to knock this out, but it's incumbent on all of us to use every lever that we have to try and make change. And I think that does fall to regulation and government, particularly while we've got the opportunity with online harms. And I think, just to move away from politicians, because I don't believe the public is always going to have the most sympathy for politicians, no matter how hard we work. The late and great Captain Sir Tom Moore had trolling in the last few weeks of his life. Hopefully he will never have seen that, but his family dealt with that. Marcus Rashford doing all the great campaigning he's been done, scoring amazing goals, abuse, racial abuse against him, the anti-vax work that is going on that is going to cause deaths if it's not attacked, pension scams. Debbie and I have been hearing evidence on select committee about the impact of that. That so much of this needs to be dealt with. And it's my view that things are so bad online that if we don't start to pull things in and make changes, that I think good people just won't be there, and it won't be used for the force for good that it can be. I mean, just have a look at the outpouring of love for Sir Tom this week. It can be a force for good, social media. And I do think that the way it's going, the arguments that making changes or regulating the internet is going to damage free speech, I would just suggest that there is no greater impairment to free speech than a woman being told that she will be raped or acid thrown in her face if she says a certain thing. And parents are not sat at home worrying about whether their children are going to be able to use social media for free speech. They're worrying about their children being online and getting abuse and being trolled or being introduced to actors that we absolutely don't want them to be anywhere near. So I've become really focused on anonymity, and the organisation I mentioned, Clean Up the Internet, I'd urge everybody that's online to look them up, and actually it'd be great if you could have them as speakers for another session. I led a debate in Parliament on behalf of my colleague Damien Hines, former Secretary of State for Education, and it was really illuminating to me, because when I was doing my research, I discovered that the government didn't actually consult about anonymity in the online harms consultation. There was no specific questions about anonymity, and I think if you ask anybody down the street whether they thought anonymous abuse accounts were a problem online, most people will say, man on Clapham Omnibus, most people say it was. So I found that strange that the government didn't ask those questions. Actually, consultees told the government what they thought about anonymous accounts anyway. So that was quite useful. But to my mind, trying to discover who is attacking you, or for the extra step for the police or the tech companies having to take to identify the attacker, is a step that we shouldn't really go down. And to recognise also within this debate that anonymous accounts do have their place for good. The whistleblowers, the journalists that use them, the young man, woman that wants to have a space to come out or identify, explore different things under cover of anonymity, I think is all important. So the four things I would like on a policy for discussion, hopefully today, and do look up, Clean Up the Internet, is number one, I'd like a proper consultation from the government about experience gathering for anonymous accounts and also some solutions. To number two, think about giving all social media users the option to verify their identity. Give them the option in the first instance. I'm not talking about banning this stuff. Let's look at other options. So think about whether the tech company should hold that verification, or whether government arm or an independent body should do that. The third thing is let's be transparent about who is or isn't verified. We've already got the blue ticks. We know that the people with the blue ticks are already verified. Can we widen that out to the public? And then the fourth thing is give people the option to follow unverified accounts if they want to. Some people really like following the spoof and sort of anonymous accounts, and some people maybe want to follow unverified accounts, but let's give people the option. And then, I mean, I would just knock out anyone that was unverified, and you'd quite quickly get rid of all the bots. You'd quite quickly get rid of quite a lot of nonsense, but let that be the option for the public. So there's kind of my policy suggestions, and I'm just in time, so thank you. Happy to answer questions.
Well done, Sean. That's brilliant. Absolutely fabulous. Right, moving swiftly on to Rosie.
Thanks, Debbie. What a pleasure to follow all those brilliant speeches. I've known Seyi for a long time, and her work with Glitch is absolutely incredible. In fact, she was an inspiration to me for my maiden speech in Parliament, and I had to mention her because not only has she done all this work, but I've also seen the kind of abuse that she gets online as a friend, and as well as my colleagues, and it's revolting, frankly, and it's still out there, but she hasn't sort of hidden away from that. I've seen that she takes breaks every now and again, but she does keep going, and that, I think, encourages and helps other people, because if we just disappear from those online platforms, you know, then those bullies and online trolls have kind of won, in a sense. So online abuse is kind of, unfortunately, part of our everyday life. We have to use those platforms if we're politicians and MPs. I've been involved with 50/50 Parliament since it began, and I've been an ambassador for that. And this is the first year that I considered not taking part in some of their Ask Her to Stand events, because I've been questioning, do I really want to encourage young people, young women, to enter this public arena? And, you know, I've been a champion of that for many years now. And it was really sad that I had to sort of start asking myself that question. But the abuse that not only I've had in the last year or so, but my colleagues have had, has just been sort of off the scale. Others have mentioned that, you know, due to the coronavirus, we've all been stuck at home looking at our computers, and it's got worse. I think a lot of our feelings and our complicated sort of stresses and personal circumstances have probably led to us being more hostile to others, more stressed. We've got no outlet. We need to look at our mental health, and therefore perhaps we are taking it out on strangers. But some of the things that I've had to read about myself, because, you know, platforms like Twitter and Facebook are unregulated, have been libelous. You know, I've been told by many lawyers this year who've approached me even about things I haven't seen written about myself, that I have got strong court cases, that I could easily win legal battles, because some of the things that have been written about me are just absolute fiction. Most of the time I choose not to engage, I choose not to read them. But when some things are sort of put in front of you and there are lies about your own family or your own background, and they're written as fact for everyone to see, and then they're shared by sort of opposition people, not opposition politicians, but people that sort of don't like my views on certain things, and they're shared as facts, you do start to think, well, should I go down that legal route? And the reason I haven't is because the energy and, you know, effort it would take, apart from the money, would just divert me from the job I've got to do, and I'm too busy, frankly, to sort of worry about, you know, what people in my constituency might read and think isn't true. I just hope that they know me better, or they can approach me and ask me if it's true if they want to know. But when it does start to, I mean, Siobhan's had some horrendous stuff, and just worth saying that we do work on a cross-party basis. And I know that the Labour women that I'm the chair of, most of the Labour women saw what happened to Siobhan, and nobody wasn't shocked and upset. So we do work together, and particularly in Parliament, we're women first and we're party political second, because we've learnt that that is what we have to be. We have to stick together. We have to be sort of sisters, really, in Parliament, because even in my first week, I was approached by a male colleague who said, how's the abuse going online? And I said, oh, I haven't really had any of that. And he said, you will. And he sat me down and he said, it's so much worse for women. And he sort of explained more about, you know, people like Diane Abbott and what she'd had to go through. And I hadn't really been that engaged with all of that. And it's true, and it's awful. And he was right. Diane Abbott's abuse, I mean, we all know the figures now, that she received more than half of the sort of racist and horrible online abuse was, you know, in 1 year was directed at this one particular woman. And she's a trailblazer for many young women and Black people in Parliament. And the fact that that's been turned into abuse is absolutely disgusting, considering what she's achieved. You may not agree with her politics, but, you know, that isn't the clever way to do it. You know, to sort of start calling her names and being racist is not a way to sort of disagree with her politics. The same with Siobhan. You know, the people on the far left, we've talked about the far right, but the people on the far left who will use the fact that she's pregnant, or, you know, just people who are misogynists that will use the fact that she's pregnant and a woman, instead of making salient political points or arguments or disagreements, you know, are pathetic, frankly. And we don't want or need to hear that. They're not making any sort of valid or interesting points. And that's the problem with those platforms. They're not really there to have proper arguments with. When I've tried to engage people, you know, within a few seconds, it turns into sort of name calling and assumptions, and people don't read what you're saying, you know, that they don't actually listen to what you're saying online. They just make assumptions, look at who you might follow. I mean, I followed Donald Trump. It doesn't mean I agree with anything the man had to say. You know, I'm interested in following all kinds of people, but I regularly get policed for who I follow on Twitter and Facebook, and it means absolutely nothing at all. So I think what we've got to do is this long-awaited online harms bill. I definitely agreed with Siobhan's points in her bill. It was a cross-party bill. We seem to all agree that the anonymity needs to be tackled, and it really needs looking at. Also, who publishes what? You know, who is liable for the publishing of content and blogs and things like that? Where does the buck stop? How are we going to regulate that? Where is the difference between Parliament regulating it and Ofcom? I think those are the things we need to look at from a sort of strategic point of view. So I've waffled on enough, and thanks very much, Debbie, for giving me the platform.
No waffling at all there, Rosie. That was very, very cogent and very to the point. So thank you very much. Thank you. You've all been brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So I'm now going to open it up to attendees to put any questions that they may have to the panel. Jeremy, are you all right if anybody has to direct any of those questions? That's absolutely fab. I can't see any, Matt. Have you managed to get some?
Oh, they are in the. Can you see the Q&A, Debbie? There are some in there. Or do you want me?
Okay, right. Let me. I've seen that Maria Miller's on the line, so I know that Maria's got her hand up. So, Maria, do you want to ask your question?
I will just get Maria. Sorry, everyone. Okay, try now, Maria.
That's brilliant, and I'm so sorry. If I'd have been more dexterous, I would have put a question in the question and answers. I'm sorry about that. I was just keen to raise the issue of around the online harms bill and what it is going to do and what it needs to do. I think the government's focus is very much on creating a duty of care on certain sections of the online world, particularly around social media providers. I campaigning very hard for it to do more than that and to improve legislation to give individuals better redress, particularly around the things that Siobhan was talking about earlier in terms and others around online abuse. I'd just be interested in hearing more about the work that people are going to be doing to try and drive that point home to the government, that the bill needs to do more than simply a duty of care. It needs to improve legislation to give individuals redress, and whether anybody has got any particular areas they're focusing on.
Who would like to have a go at that one?
I mean, I can certainly say that, having listened to the Minister Caroline Dinenage, that they're going to do some consultative legislation with MPs. So there are going to be a number of opportunities, and the government doesn't have to do that, but they're really keen to hear from MPs from across the House about the bill as it is and other aspects of it. I mean, you've heard my views on anonymity, and that's just one area. I know that other people are campaigning. So, for example, the Money and Mental Health Institute are doing some amazing work to try and highlight financial scams and the impact of financial abuse, basically, accounts. So I think it's going to be a very lively debate leading into legislation coming forward, and there'll be lots of opportunities to speak to your MP about that. I don't know whether Jeremy has sort of heard more.
Well, I think you're right. There's going to be some pre-legislative scrutiny process before we get the legislation itself. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to say what we think is missing and what we think needs to be improved. And say a bit more about that at the end. But I do think that when it comes to individual redress, it'll be important to recognise that if we asked a regulator to deal with individual cases of bad content online, the regulator would be swiftly overwhelmed. So I think what we'll have to set up is something in parallel with what a regulator will do, which is to look at the systems and processes that every platform has got to deal with some of the things that have been talked about so far, which will also enable individuals to get redress. And the other point I'll make is that in relation to the terms and conditions of each platform, it'll be important to understand what the interaction is between those terms and conditions and what the regulator does. So if the regulator doesn't think the terms and conditions are adequate that are being used by any given platform, what can the regulator do about it? I think that'll be important too.
Good point. So Rosie, did I see your hand wanting to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we all feed in from our experience. I mean, Maria, you particularly have mentioned deep fakes in Parliament quite a lot, and you're really involved in the upskirting and all those kinds of issues. So I think revenge porn and those things that you know an awful lot about need to be fed in. And we, you know, when we get to debate this in Parliament, after the sort of initial bits of legislation are sort of done, we need to be able to add on those sort of specific things and be able to talk about them. And then individuals will be able to tell us, you know, it was an individual that moved the upskirting bill, wasn't it? You know, we wouldn't have got that through without her. So I think I can't remember her name, sorry, it's very rude of me, but, you know, and Shay's experience as well, you know, we need to be able to have evidence from people who know what they're talking about and make it count in the bill, I think.
If I may just really quickly answer. So it's very clear that this bill won't tackle individual redress, which is really sad and disappointing, because I think it perpetuates the need to have social capital and class and networks to be able to pull together a class action and be able to take on the tech giants. And I think it perpetuates that inability for the individuals who have helped shape society today, be able to do that with tech companies. What we are seeing being proposed is some kind of system redress, and I think that's therefore the role that this bill and conversations moving forward needs to look at the role of civil society and how you can equip and resource them to be able to help be a listening ear or a platform or an advocate or a channel into Ofcom as the regulator, to be able to raise incidences of cases, because it is those stories and those lived experiences that help us understand what harm is. I remember being on a roundtable conversation with the Epilepsy Society and hearing how women with epilepsy are sent purposely graphic and flashing images to spark an epileptic attack. I would never have known that if it wasn't hearing the experiences from disabled communities. So we have to make sure that we don't lose the way that civil societies can be a listening ear, because that is also a problem that we currently have. That tech companies are making slow progress and reform, but on the labour of civil societies doing the work for free, doing surveys and research for free. So if we're not going to have individual redress as part of this bill, we need to look at how we arm our civil society to be able to take actions further for us.
Fab, very good point, Shay. Thanks everyone. I believe there's a really interesting question from the BBC, Matt. Are you able to read it out? Whenever I put it on, it overwhelms the screen. So
no problem. Okay, so I'll try and summarize as quickly as I can, but we're currently investigating dating apps, and we've uncovered what appears to be quite widespread abuse of these platforms by criminals, from fraudsters to sexual predators of both adults and minors. There doesn't appear to be any reference made in publications around the online harms bill that relates to the regulation of these spaces. Could I get the panel's perspective on what the scope is for greater oversight or legislation of these spaces to better protect vulnerable users? Okay.
Go in reverse order. Shay, I saw your hand go up, and then Siobhan. I don't know, Joe, if you want to come in at all. Yeah, okay.
I'll be very, very quick. It's sad that it doesn't talk about dating apps. I think that was because in itself, it's such a wide scope from conversations that we've had and roundtables that we've been a part of. And I think this is also why further consultation needs to be done with women's groups to give us reassurance that if it's not covered in this bill, where will it be covered? I know there's a consultation on sex-based abuse, or image-based and sex abuse that we won't hear the results of until next year. And so many forms of and tactics of online abuse will have developed by then that it's not quick enough. I think when it comes to scamming and online fraud and sexual predators. We also need to think about how that intersects with young people. You've got girls who are purposely, and young boys who are being purposely sorted out, and there's a real link between online space and sex trafficking, and that has increased. And I think this is where we can learn from our sister partners in Eastern Europe, who are having a real understanding around the relationship with online abuse and sex trafficking. I think there's work we can build on the work of Hope Not Hate to look at basically the radicalization of women and young girls online. There is a form but building here of a women's version of incels, a women's version of radicalization happening, and we need to unpack it. And I think we need a feasibility study that looks at how young people, older people are being scammed across all platforms. And as Joe said, not just the main tech giants.
Fab, Seyi. Joe.
Yeah, just basically that, actually. I've said that twice now, but no. I mean, I think something, again, we occasionally look at dating apps and stuff at Hope Not Hate for exactly that reason. Of course, misogyny is central to the groups and individuals that we would monitor doing harm, but also how we see racism on these apps as well, and also how we see alternative dating apps specifically used, for example, by the far right, white-only dating apps, etc. So I think this just reiterates the point I was kind of making in terms of the breadth of platforms being used. And I know I'm just it's really boring when people just inject complexity into things and say it's more complicated than that. But the real danger here is that we end up regulating, and the discussion around regulation is just with the major platforms that everyone's familiar with because everyone uses them. And actually the way that online harms work is way more complex than that, is way broader than that, and is done in way more different spaces than just the 3 or 4 big platforms. And the way that these things interact, the platforms interact, is really central. So if we're going to actually deal with online harms, there's no point in having a really robust approach to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube and ignoring these corners of the internet where real harm is done. And often, actually, where we see the interface between online and offline and like street level harm isn't through Facebook and Twitter. It is through these unwatched corners of the internet, if you will, or less regulated and less watched corners, often spaces that are co-opted or not created for the purposes that the far right are using them for. So yes, I mean, it's not just dating apps, but that's one example. And it's a really important thing that when we need to really survey the breadth of platforms in use and the types of harms that are used in different corners of the internet. Otherwise, we're going to end up with quite a myopic bill that deals with one problem, but not lots of the others. Okay, and so it just sort of grows from there. Siobhan.
Yeah, I mean, I was just to say, the government is thinking about apps, and I think so. I just, because this was read in response about the online harms white paper, the minister said social media websites, apps, and other services that host user-generated content or things that allow people to talk to one another online will need to remove and limit the spread of illegal content. And she goes on to talk about the kind of main focuses, such as child abuse, terrorist material, and suicide contact. So that work is there, the thinking is already there about that user generated and that sort of discursive element, those platforms that can be used for abuse. And I think that's why this pre-legislative scrutiny and ability for us to push and pull things and really raise these additional points around, just to really understand where the legislation is going, is important. But the government is on board with looking at all vehicles for abuse.
Right, we've got 7 minutes left until Jeremy winds up for us. So we're going to have pithy answers, as the speaker would say. So I know that Emma Hardy, MP for Hull and Hessel, I think, is also wanted to ask a question. So let's bring Emma if we can.
Thanks, everybody, and apologies for being a little bit later. I got caught up in a previous meeting. So quick question was really about online abuse linked to news articles. I know it's kind of niche, but there seems to be an awful lot of abuse happening in the comment section of news articles, and I'm concerned that this online harms bill is exempting newspapers from having to moderate or check the comment section. And that's particularly where we find an awful lot of abuse directed, not just at politicians, but many other people. And I just wondered if the panel could sort of comment on that specifically. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Emma. Okay, quick responses if that's okay, because I know there are a couple of others that we want to try and get in. Go on, Joe.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's a hole in the legislation as it is.
Yeah.
I think not just in terms of people directing and experiencing direct abuse within that space online, but also the way that we see radicalization happening through that, conscious efforts to recruit and to go into comment sections under articles and say, have you read, or you found this interesting, you should read this. We start to see it as often the first door on a radicalization pathway, often to more extreme content, as well as seeing it as a place where people actually attack people and engage in online harm. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a hole, actually, yeah.
Good points. Yeah. And any additional, Jeremy?
I'm gonna stop myself from defending the white paper just because I'm partly responsible for it. But I think one of the things we're going to have to remind ourselves throughout this conversation is that this bill, this measure, should not be the only thing we do about the problems that exist online. And there's a danger that if this bill is expected to do everything, it will become the Christmas tree of all Christmas trees and probably fall over under its own weight. The objective here, at least initially, was to focus on unregulated spaces. Now, we can certainly have a separate and long conversation about whether the media and press are properly regulated, but they're not an entirely unregulated space. So it may be that this is an area where we should be having a conversation about how to improve media regulation that already is there, rather than trying to encapsulate it in this bill, is all I would suggest.
Fair point. Right, I think there's just, let me have a quick look at these questions, if I may.
Debbie, if you don't mind, there's there's lots of questions around anonymity that I would love to be able to just give a 30-second spiel on.
Okay, I know there's one from Danny Stone. Matt, are you able to read that out?
Absolutely. Give me one sec. What do the panel think of the potential for compelling regulated entities to be established as corporate entities in the UK with all of the legal responsibilities that would follow?
Who wants to have again, we're going to have pithy answers. We've got 3 minutes left. Go on, Jeremy.
I'll just, the quick answer is that the significant point here is, do we have sufficient purchase on the corporate entity to require them to comply with the duty of care and impose sanctions if they don't? I'm not convinced, wasn't at the time, that requiring them to be a corporate entity entirely within the UK is necessary to do that. But we should do whatever we have to make sure that A, they have to comply with the duty of care, B, we can impose sanctions if they don't.
Nice and pithy, that one. That's grand. Okay, anybody, Seyi, you wanted to quickly mention about anonymity.
Yeah, a word that I struggle to say, so apologies if I trip up, but it came up quite a lot. And I think I'd like to share that I've come on a journey around anonymity. When I was trolled and abused many years ago when I was a counsellor, and I felt like a lot of it was down to anonymous trolling, and wanted everyone to give Twitter their ID and their passport and say who they were. And actually listening to the global south and the international community, listening to freedom fighters who are trying to fight for basic human rights against dictators, us making up blanket statements around anonymity could be doing harm to our international community. But I think there is still an opportunity for us to look at where we don't have being an absolutely anonymous and no accountability, and being who you really are online. And I think that's by looking at product design and looking at having the ability to see the account that you're engaging with. Do they follow somebody that you have a mutual contact with? Because that gives you some, first of all, assurance that they're a real person and they want to engage. I think the second thing is around a concept that we've termed here at Glitch called digital self-care, giving users better agency. And this means that the platform needs to make this a better option, giving users the ability to be able to filter out accounts that haven't bothered to verify their email address and haven't bothered to verify their phone numbers and haven't bothered to change their profile photo, because that already tells you that this person or these accounts are not willing to engage in this platform the way that you want to. And I think there's a need to give that option to MPs, to politicians, to people in public life who I think are kind of sometimes felt restricted from being able to block and mute and filter people, because the name of democracy means that we should all be up for grabs. And I think there's a real need to be able to clarify what's accountability and who, when you're able to kind of block and mute and filter those people. But I just think there's a real danger to blame the whole bad World Wide Web on anonymity when we only just banned Trump 4 years later. He was very much himself. We only just banned Katie Hopkins, Wiley. There are many people who are very much themselves, causing hate, that are not hiding behind anonymous trolling.
Thank you so much. It is now 5 to 5, and I'm going to ask Jeremy to wind up for us with his closing remarks. I am fortunately going to have to go, but I just wanted to take the opportunity, first of all, to thank all the panelists for their fantastic contributions. This is the start of a conversation, I think, as far as this group is concerned. So we will keep you updated, and anybody that didn't get a chance to ask a question, we'll make sure that you have an opportunity to get a response. So thank you so much, everyone, and over to you, Jeremy. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie, and thanks for chairing this so effectively, and I'm grateful for the invitation to say something. I'll try and say something about the way in which all of this has unfolded throughout our conversation, and then try and pick up on a couple of questions I've noted in the chat as well. So as I say, I have to plead guilty to having something to do with this. I was the Secretary of State for DCMS at the time at which the white paper was produced, and things have changed a bit since then, but I'd be lying if I didn't say I'm pleased to see that the direction of travel in the white paper is, broadly speaking, being followed, because I think it's the right direction of travel. And that's partly, at least, because, as we've all said, this is a problem that has to now be addressed. We simply can't live in a world where, if we're having more and more time online, doing more and more of our functional existence online, we allow that space to be utterly unregulated, when in every other environment we spend time, whether it's the real world, broadcast media, print media, you name it, regulation exists. So something has to be done. And I think it's true because of its own importance. It's true, as Joe said, because what starts online sometimes moves offline, and therefore we have to be concerned about all of that. The approach that the process that we've initiated with the white paper and continued with the consultation and on, I hope, into legislation, the logic behind it is really this, that there should be a responsibility on online platforms to do the best they can to keep their users safe. Not everything, but what is reasonable to do. And that means that there has to be a duty of care on all of them. I happen to take the view that one of the deficiencies in the current proposals are, as others have said this afternoon, if you try and have a category of large platforms that we act on, and a category of small platforms that we worry less about, it doesn't allow, as Joe said, for the use of smaller platforms for some very pernicious things. It doesn't allow either for smaller platforms suddenly gaining much more impact and reach than we expected very quickly, and that can happen. So it's important the system is flexible enough for that. It's important we have an independent regulator. It can't actually be for government to decide what's good and bad online. It must be for an independent regulator to do that. And we've got to, I think, recognize, as I said earlier, that if we allowed a regulator to spend its time deciding whether an individual piece of bad content should be left up or taken down, it would do very little else. So important that we produce something in parallel with that. I'm not pretending this is perfect, far from it. And there are gaps, and we've talked about quite a lot of those gaps. The first of them is around whether there is sufficient breadth in the harms that are covered in the online harms process. Have we got everything right? Almost certainly not. If you limit the harm that you're concerned about to significant harm to an individual, then you miss things out. What about harm to democracy? What about some of the disinformation that is being promulgated, which doesn't necessarily affect individuals at an individual level, but certainly affects us all collectively? What about the fact that we are dealing here quite often with business models that are quite deliberately structured to support pernicious and hateful material? Some of the things that my colleagues here have had to put up with are largely promulgated on platforms that benefit from people continuing to look at content, continuing to engage in argument, And it's certainly clear that when you look at the algorithms that are being used, some of these platforms don't much mind whether this is hateful content or not, as long as people continue to look at it, comment on it, and stay on the site in order to see advertisements. Now, that's something that this bill has to think about too. It's got to think about enforcement. There's a question in the chat about individual director liability, which is being held back in reserve at the moment. I'm not convinced it should be. Neither am I convinced that when you talk about the liability of individual directors, it should just be liability for failing to give information to the regulator. Well, what happens if they give all the information to the regulator, but they're behaving very badly nonetheless? Surely something should be done about that. And in the other lists of things that are missing, Siobhan has talked about anonymity. This is hugely difficult for the reasons that Seyi and others have given, but I don't think we can dodge it. I think there has to be, as Seyi said, a way of making sure that anonymity is never absolute. Anonymity in other areas of your life is never absolute. If you are arrested, you are required to tell the police who you are, and they're entitled to try and find out if you don't. That shouldn't be different online. So there are limits to anonymity in every other area of our lives. There should be limits to it online, albeit anonymity, for the reasons she gave, is helpful and important in many contexts. There's nothing in this yet about age verification. There needs to be. We need to talk about how we make sure that when it comes to some services, those people who are underage are not able to access them. And I think we also have to focus on media literacy in its broadest sense, as Seyi said. There has to be a focus on education, because in the end, however good we are at legislating, however good we are at regulating, in the end, we won't catch every piece of bad content reaching every vulnerable user. So we have to make all of us better digital citizens in every sense, more resolute, more robust, more resilient to everything that is being thrown at us online, because it will continue to be, even if we regulate successfully. And then finally, I suppose I should just say that I think it's hugely important, as others have said, that we work together on this. There's already huge cross-party interest in this, huge willingness, I think, to make this work. And already you're seeing a large number of groups working together. I chaired a meeting last week of 8 all-party groups, of which this all-party group was one. And I think there is a broad measure of agreement in how we can improve this legislation. And that's what now needs to happen, because this is an absolutely golden opportunity, not just to improve the online world with all its positive features that have been mentioned, but also to give some genuine global leadership here. This country is still ahead of the rest in terms of developing these kinds of proposals for regulation. And therefore, let's get it right. And let's make sure that we all participate in the process of improving this legislation when it comes. It started off, I think, on the right lines, though I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do think it's capable of significant improvement in many of the ways and others that we've already discussed. So I hope that's helpful. And thank you, everybody, for participating in this process. Let me thank in particular all the speakers who've done such a great job of encapsulating their views in what's been a limited amount of time. But I think this is the start, as Debbie says, of a process, not the end of it. And we've got a lot of work to do to make sure that this bill fulfills its very great potential. And I think on that basis, Matt, unless there's anything you want to say on behalf of the APPG.
No, that's it. Brilliant. Brilliant closing.
We can wish everybody a good afternoon and look forward to continuing this conversation elsewhere. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Take care.